Mending with blanket stitches when you have a spot on the sock that's almost worn out or thinned out. Choose a starting point anywhere near the edge of the worn out spot on the sock you want to strengthen. Pull the needle and yarn through the sock and to the front where you want the edge of the shape to be. You can choose the starting point anywhere around the edge. Leave a tail for weaving in later when you have finished sewing the shape. Slide the needle sideways to the right, needle pointing upwards, and push the needle into the knit and about 5 millimeters up and through to the front. Pull the needle and yarn all the way through to the surface. Be sure to wrap the yarn under the needle and make a loop for the yarn to be hooked in. The stitch made looks a bit like a half square or a horseshoe, if you will. Repeat the stitch, but leave some space between the new and the previous stitch. The spacing is really up to you, but it's important in the beginning to not place the stitches too close to each other, as you will continue darning in a spiral shape and the space between each new stitch will become smaller as you continue on. Elina, who is darning in all of these 3 clips in this video, has chosen a round form for this first clip, since that is the easiest shape when it comes to mending garments with blanket stitches. This kind of darning doesn't have to cover the whole spot completely, it's just supposed to strengthen the worn out part on the sock and to have the garment from wearing out in the near future. Continue darning the stitches in a circle around the edge of the thinned out spot. When you've completed this first row of stitches around the hole and you're back to where you started, make the first stitch on the second row into both the surface of the sock, where your worn out stitches are, and into the blanket stitch you made on the previous row. From now on, you'll be sewing new blanket stitches into every stitch on every row. Just remember to always catch both the knit stitches on the sock and the previous blanket stitches on lower rows. Also, do not make the stitches too high, since you want to strengthen the thinned out spot. If the rows are too high, the patch won't look neat and flat. If you're unsure of how your stitches will look, practice on some scrap fabric, and when you're sure about the stitches, start darning on your worn out socks. It's always possible to unravel the stitches by removing the needle and pulling the sewn yarn out if you're not satisfied. If the yarn gets tangled up, which it often does when sewing by hand, just let go of the needle and hang the yarn from the sock to untangle it. Or untangle it by hand by stretching the yarn out. The blanket stitch is a very expressive stitch, since it can be used on so many fabrics, garments, and clothing. You can sew it onto edges on all kinds of cloth like blankets, handkerchiefs, and table runners. You can neaten small holes on clothes with it and even sew together fabric layers with it. Blanket stitches always have consistent spacing between each stitch. If you make the stitches closer to the other, it's called the buttonhole stitch, but that stitch is not our subject for today. If you are left-handed, the stitch is basically the same, but you sew from right to left, mirroring the process. Now continue darning in spirals until you reach the very center of the shape and your form is complete. In this first clip, the darning mushroom has been placed inside the sock before we started filming, but you'll be able to see how to do that part later on in the video. Sew into every stitch on the previous row. Don't jump over any stitches because it's not necessary when you have space between. And as I mentioned about the height of the stitches before, don't make them too high either. It's possible to form shapes like circles, oblongs, and oval shapes, squares and triangles onto surfaces you want to cover. If you, for example, chose to make shapes that has corners, you will have to jump over stitches in all corners on every row. Otherwise, you'll end up with a cylinder-formed shape that rises from the surface. So if you end up wanting a shape with corners, practice on scrap fabric and you'll soon notice where and how to reduce stitches in the corners of the shape. This shape has 4 blanket rows, so it's very easy and quick to finish. It's decorative and eye-catching. It looks nice with colorful contrasting yarn on striped or non-striped garments. The choice of colors is really up to you. Choose what inspires you the most. So when you are finished on the front and you have reached the center of the shape, loosen the string that holds the darning mushroom in place and take out the mushroom. Push in your hand into the sock and push the needle into the center of the mend and out through the back surface of the sock. Turn the sock over to clean up all loose ends of yarn. With your needle, weave in the tail of the yarn by sewing into the backs of the stitches to avoid the yarn from unraveling or coming undone, and for the sock to be comfortable to wear. In the middle of the mend, weave the yarn into the stitches in a circle. Never make knots, since they are not secure when wearing a garment as stretchy as a sock. Cut off the yarn, thread the needle, this time we show you how to weave in the yarn in a zigzag way. Sew the first row and catch a few backs of the stitches. Turn and sew to the opposite side. Turn again and sew under the backs of the stitches. This is kind of like a zigzag form. Cut the yarn and turn your sock back so you can see the front and the finished shape. Steam the patch for a neat finish. And you're done. Nice work.